Hello, and welcome to Scottish Summit 2021. Welcome to my session about continuous integration for the business intelligence developer or the business intelligence development team. Before we start, I would like to show you the sponsors of that event. Without them, this event wouldn't be possible. My name is Wolfgang. I'm working as a data consultant in Austria. I live in Austria, and I'm building database solutions with our customers. I started my career in the software engineering field and quickly got into the database area, and I built data warehouses for several years, and now I'm deep into the data integrating, data warehousing in Azure and Power BI stuff. So let's dive deeper and see how continuous integration for a business intelligence development team can solve some problems. Imagine we are now part of a new business intelligence development team. We start a new job and we are working into the new project. We get to know the new project we have to deal with, and our team colleagues, they are talking and preparing us about all the stuff they already built. And what they've done in the past is they've built a business intelligence project and architecture based on, well, several source systems using SQL Server integration services, stage the data in the database and process it further, transform it into a dimensional modeling database, a relational data warehouse. And based on that, they build a semantic layer using analyzer services Tabular. User interface, reporting, front end is Power BI. And what our team does, they develop solutions. Well, they use SQL Server Management Studio. They use SQL Server Management Studio to change and develop database stuff. They use Visual Studio to create and change existing integration services, packages, data flows, and so on. And they also use Visual Studio to develop the tabular mode. They store all those development artifacts on hard drive. They store it in folders. They store it as copies, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, they use Power BI Desktop to publish those reports to the Power BI service. And when we talked about the overall development approach, well, they said, hey, that's the way we roll. And they showed it to me, and I was somehow a little bit, what are they doing? Because they have no development system. They only have one production system, and they are directly working in the database, in the production database. And as you can see here, well, they create some sort of, well, backups of existing objects like views in that example, or they are directly opening and modifying stored procedures in the database. They also use the development and directly deploy approach in Visual Studio for integration services, packages, and for the SSIS tabular model. And last but not least, well, they have some sort of versioning implemented, because they store versions of their development in folders on their hard drives. Sometimes they add a date, sometimes they add some sort of milestone versioning, whatever. But the main concern I saw there was they are storing the things on their own hard drive. So we have multiple copies of maybe almost the same source code on different laptops, on different notebooks. And nobody knows what is the current version that is deployed to the system. And that is a thing, well, where the red telephone just came into. We got calls almost every day because reports weren't working, numbers weren't correct. There were problems during data integration processes, and so on and so forth. And before Corona, we've been in the office and we had a telephone there. And with Corona, during lockdown, well, we had mobile phones, we had team calls, and we had many hours spent fixing problems. And we had sleepless nights because we had to fix those problems before the next business day, because the business said, hey, we need those numbers, you have to fix it. It's your problem. We haven't changed it. It's your fault. And well, some days I looked like that one on the slide. It was horrible because we had no time to build new features. We only had to solve problems during the day to keep that system somehow running, and no new features, no expansion of functionality, no new reports, no new data sources integrated. And during one of those team meetings, well, I'm also there, we talked and discussed it. And I said, hey, we need to change something. And it's not the best way how we spend our days, because we could build somehow more better solutions. And my boss, she said, well, I like that idea and I give you some time. You get 1 week, but during that session, we've got no week to spend. She said, okay, you've got 1 hour. And the clock is running. We have to hurry up to get everything into place. And what was the first thing? We started with a wish list. We collected all those things we need to do and things we wanted to have in our new environment. And our to-do and wish list, well, it looked like that. The first thing was we want to have a development environment. Don't develop in production, develop in develop environment and deploy to production whenever it's ready. And we wanted to use that approach to clone the production database, keep it in sync, develop new features, and whenever ready, well, afterwards deploy it to the production environment. Another topic, common development structure. All those folder-based versions of the different development artifacts, well, they were stored on different hard drives. They were stored on laptop A and laptop 10 and laptop 11, whatever. We had no real latest version, no common truth. So that is a thing I wanted to really address during my work and week of Get Better project. And automation is a thing. You can do everything manually, but if we could automate some stuff and some tasks in the processes, well, we could spend more time on implementing new features, like creating new dev environments or something else. And last but not least, before those changes were introduced, we had somehow a change. Somebody changed something and we didn't have some sort of traceability. What was the overall change between yesterday's version and today's version to fix all those problems? And traceability is one of those things we wanted to implement. And the first part was to create a dev environment. And as I said, my colleagues, well, they worked with the database directly. They opened a view definition, they changed a view definition, they saved a new view definition. And that is the thing where it is contrary to the approach of SQL Server database tools database projects, because those are not focusing and not working directly with the database. They are focusing on the final state of the object. Whenever you're dealing with a database project, well, you are defining the final structure of a database object, like a table, a stored procedure, a view, or whatever. And you are not generating alter statements like add a new column or whatever. You define the final structure, and the database project and the publishing process, well, that process handles that for you. So, sounds interesting? It is interesting, and it's very easy to start with. Let's have a look in the first demo. Database projects, well, they are a new project type in Visual Studio. And if you create a new SQL Server database project, what you get is an empty project. What you can do is you can add some sort of new item. And whenever I click add new item, I have all my different database object types in here. And what I can add is I would like to add a new table, and it's a person table. Just call it person. And as you can see here, we get a new SQL file in there. And that SQL file, well, it can be changed in two ways. We've got that graphical editor, the structure editor, like first name, and we've got the 60 characters for the first name. And as you can see, we have a change. We've made the change in the graphical editor, and the SQL editor, well, it's in sync. And whenever I add a last name column over here, and I just move to somewhere else, well, the other way around is changed. So what we define in our database project is we define the final structure of the object, and not the I create a table, add one column, and then I've got a change script to add another column. What you can also do is we can add a new view in here, and I call it the person view. And what you can see here, we've got some sort of IntelliSense and some sort of error information. Some table of view doesn't exist. Okay, that sounds nice. And now we've got the person table in here, and now it looks good. And whenever I'm gonna select and start typing, I've got the IntelliSense in here. I've got the last name, and I've got the person's ID. Well, that one doesn't exist. I've got no column person in here, but if I change it to person ID, doesn't look good because the column is called ID. And what we've created now, well, it's an almost empty project containing a person and a person view SQL. And what we can do next is, well, we've defined the structure, but we've not worked with the database directly. So our database server, let's look here, the database, well, it doesn't exist. What we need to do is we need to deploy that database. So we can start the publishing process over there, and we need to specify the target database connection. And I'm gonna go here, change it to, I call it Scottish Summit database. And I start the publishing process. And what is done behind the scenes? Those SQL files are compiled, and in the background, it's a process that takes the definition, compares it to the target database, and starts to execute those statements that are necessary to get the same structure in the target database that is defined in the source. And the source is our database project. And whenever I open it here, well, I've got my table in there, and there should be the person view. Yeah, it's there. And what we can do now is we can do some sort of refactoring, because we can rename that person view. It's the view person. And we've got the preview changes. Okay, what are the objects that are refactored? And when we hit the publish again, oh, okay, I haven't saved. Database connection, generate or start the publishing process, and fingers crossed, this should work. Source, the project is compared to the structure of the database. Let's go over here and do the refresh of the views, and we've got the view person in there. So that is nice if you can start on the green field, but in our project, well, we had the structure of our databases already existing. So what you can do is, I'm gonna add a new project, to my solution, new wide importers. And I've got an empty database project, and what you can do is you can use the import functionality. You can use the import over here, and you can fetch the structure of an already existing database. So let's start over here. Select the connection. No, I'm going to select the wild word importers. And I'm going to leave the default settings. And what is done now? Our database project, well, it reads the structure of the database. We've got schemas in there, we've got tables, we've got views, we've got stored procedures. And as you can see, the project explorer on the right side, it filled up with schemas like a security schema, sales schema, and we've got some sort of tables in there. So we've got the definition of the buying group in there. And that is the start where you can take your already existing database project and move it into your existing database and move it into a database project. So very, very easy. But there is no common development structure, because with that approach, we also have those different copies on all our machines and no real central approach. So the one version of the truth or the source code, well, we need to get away from the local stored versions. We need to get away from those multiple copies, and we need to get away or get into the field of version control. And version control, whenever you heard about that, and if you come from the software engineering field, version control is there, and version control is just used. But in business intelligence projects, well, version control, source control, it's not that kind of approach those BI developers are familiar with, or they even don't know what it is. So basically is you take the source code and you store it somewhere else. And everybody of your colleagues, well, takes their versions and they store it also on one and only a single place. And if you start working on a new feature, you check the remote repository if there is a new version, if one of your colleagues has changed something, and you get that new version to your local working directory, you do some changes, you develop, and whenever you're done, you store it in the central repository. So that is the idea behind. But we've got one week of let's try it out. And my boss said, hey, it shouldn't cost too much. Ideally, it would be a no-cost approach. And I did some research and I found a thing that is called Azure DevOps. And that is a web-based, a cloud-based, well, software engineering platform. And with that approach, we could do everything we wanted to do, because we can store our version and our software source code in a central repository. Those are those Azure repos. We can do our project planning using Azure boards. And whenever we want to get into the field of automation, we will get to that later, we've got that thing called Azure pipelines. But sounds nice. How much does it cost? And lucky as we are, there is a basic plan, which basically is a free plan for the first 5 users, which is very good because our team, we are 5 in our team, and we can start with the basic plan. And everything we need is included. We've got the repos in there, so version control is possible. We can do our planning using Azure boards. We can start automation with Azure pipelines. So very, very nice. And how does it look like and how does it feel? Well, let's create a new Azure DevOps project. Back to our demo machine. And I've already logged into our Azure DevOps environment. And as you can see, I've created several projects in there. And a new project it's very easy to create that one. Scottish Summit project. And that's it. You can change the type of version control. I'm gonna stick to Git and just create the new project. And what we get now is the overall foundation of our development. It's a thing where we can store our source code, where we can do our project planning, and we can start the automation of our everything needed tasks. And let's start with the central repository, the source code repository. And there is one repository in there, but it's, well, empty. And what you should do and what you should not forget is to initialize that repository. And let's have a look here. You should add some sort of Git Ignore file. And that Git Ignore file adds you some sort of ignore rules for some certain file types. Because without them, everything that you create in your local repository would be pushed to the remote repository. And in some cases, it's not the best idea. So just add a Git Ignore for Visual Studio and hit the initialize button. What we get now is an empty repository. And as a next step, I would like to take the already created source code we've got here and put it into my remote repository. So you can hit the clone repository action in there. And in the Team Explorer in Visual Studio, we need to connect to a remote repository. So we can do, we clone that one, and let's clone it. Open Explorer, and let's see, there's nothing in there in our local version control. It's only the Git Ignore and the README. And what is needed now is, I'm gonna take the already created database projects and I copy them to the new created local repository. I add them in there. Just go over here and let's have a look at the changes over there. And as you can see, we've got all those files created locally now in our change list. And that is my initial check-in. I'm gonna do the commit and sync it to the remote repository. And now, some seconds to wait. Let's move to the web browser, hit refresh over there, and we've got it here. And what we get now is the version history of our files. So we can have a look at the history, who has changed what, and if there would be more check-ins, we could see all those changes that were made to the source control. So very easy to start with a database, already existing database, move it into a database project and put it into version control. So very, very easy and for free with Azure DevOps. So source code, we have to clone the remote repository to a local directory, and afterwards we have to look out for the changes and check in all those changes. We commit those changes to the remote side. And on the remote side or in Visual Studio, we can have a look at the history. Here you can see we've got all those changes that were made to a specific file, to a folder, or the overall project structure. And if you set that setting that there is a comment required, you have the traceability, because everybody is required to enter a comment during the commit process. So traceability, we know what you did yesterday, what you changed, and we have some sort of idea what we need to change back if there is a problem today. And there's one thing that is missing, because with that approach, we have the database project, we have to check it in, but we have to do the deployment manually. We have to start the publish process, and that is a thing that we could automate, because it's every day the same approach. We don't have to change the database connection string, because we want to deploy to the production environment. We want to deploy to the development environment. So it's every day the same approach. And with the approach of, or the idea of automation, there's a thing that is called pipeline, the Azure DevOps pipelines. And with that approach, we build a process that takes the latest version of the source code. That process is called checkout. That approach builds the database. What does build a database project mean? Well, it takes the definition and it checks if there are some invalid references, if there is a few that references a column in a table that is not there. And if that works fine, we can automate that publishing and deployment approach. So we don't need to open Visual Studio, right-click publish, check the or define the database configuration and hit the publish. So that can be automated. And with the continuous process and the continuous integration, which is CI and part of my session's title, well, in software engineering, if you're talking about continuous integration, it's the process of merging all of our work, all of our team members' work into a shared repository. Not once per day, but continuously. Whenever you did a change and you say, okay, I'm done with the change, commit it to the main repository. And that is the approach of continuous integration. It picks the code from every developer into a single repository. And if we build on that continuous integration, we could do some validation, some automatic validation, because whenever there's a change, whenever there's a save task on the remote repository, we could do and start the build of the source code of our database. And that is called the continuous deployment, because the continuous deployment, well, it picks up where the continuous integration ends. So if we have a valid build of our database project, well, it takes that build and it delivers all those artifacts into environments. And we will see in a later demo, those artifacts don't need to be database only. They can be of integration services, analysis services, or even Power BI artifacts. And it takes that in an automated way. So that is the concept of data DevOps. So in former times, it was like the business intelligence teams build a solution. Whenever they are done, they put it into production. And then it was the operations team that was responsible for that. And with the DevOps team, it changes. Like everybody is responsible for doing the development and also, well, monitoring the operations in the production system. So it's a circle and not, well, it's your part now approach. But somebody has to do the work. And when dealing with Azure DevOps, we have two types of agents. Agents are those processes that are, well, they have to do the work. And we've got that approach of Microsoft hosted agents. Those are virtual machines that are running in the cloud. And whenever you start a continuous integration, a continuous development approach, Microsoft, well, provides you with those hosted agents. In the basic plan, there is a limited number of build minutes included. I think it's 1,800 minutes per month. But on the other side, you can install and configure that build agent process on your own machine. And that is the approach I took for my demo. I installed the self-hosted agent on a Windows machine. You can install it on macOS or Linux. With the Windows approach, it's very easy. it's PowerShell and starting the configuration script. And then you have a build agent that is waiting for work. And we can assign that pipeline to a build agent. And how does a pipeline look like? Well, we can create a new pipeline. A new pipeline can be created very, very easy because we just hit the new pipeline here. We select that kind of version control system. It's Git in our Azure DevOps project. I select the main branch and I'm going to start with a starter pipeline. So a starter pipeline, well, it's empty. It's very not special because it's only containing two steps. And those steps are just hello world and hello I'm here steps. But what is nice here and what is nice to see here, it's some sort of configuration definition. It's based on the YAML language, yet another markup language. And what you can see here, that starter pipeline is using an Linux-based, Ubuntu-based virtual image. And we've got two steps. We've got the script task over here and the second script task over there. And we can save that one and save and run it. And what we get now is a job that is queued because that job takes or uses Microsoft hosted agents. So it's not using our own agent, and we have to wait before we get into the queue of, or before we get a running machine assigned. Now the job is started and we get all those steps one after the other and the step is done. So nothing special. It was a virtual machine, Ubuntu based, and two steps. For the database project, well, it gets a little bit more not really complicated because what we need to do is we need several steps because we need to fetch the new version of the version control, and then we need to build the database project. And that is done by a Visual Studio build task. And we can add and modify the build task or the build pipeline over there, or we can just open the properties over there. And I'm going to select the Wild World Importers database project and build the version or the source code. Next step, we need to build integration services because our project is based and using SQL Server integration services packages. And there's an SSIS build task. So whenever we open that one, it's an SSIS build task. And there are many tasks included in Azure DevOps, but sometimes those tasks are not well included from the startup. And there is some sort of marketplace, and you can search for third-party tasks and embed and configure them into your DevOps tenant. So for example, for all those SSIS tasks, like the build or the deployment task afterwards, I used third-party configurations and tasks. So very easy to search for them, to install them and use them. And what else do we have here? Well, we need to build everything, like the database project plus the integration services project. And then we need to deploy the database to, or the database project to the database server. And that is done by using the SQL DECpack deployment or database deploy task. And we define the input, which is the Wild World Importers DECpack file. We define the target server, the target database name, and the authentication information. And we, in our environment, we've got two databases, the Wild World Importers and the Wild World Importers Data Warehousing Database. So we have two deployment tasks. And then there's a deployment task for integration services. So we've got the deployment task for integration services to be deployed to integration services catalog Wild World Importers folder. For analysis services, well, we can do that in an automated way too, because there is Tabular Editor. Maybe you've heard about Tabular Editor, maybe you've not heard about Tabular Editor. If you haven't heard about Tabular Editor, check it out. It's a very, and to be honest, the best tool to build tabular models, and it can be used in command line to deploy the model.bim file to an analysis services server. As we are not sure if we have the latest version of Tabular Editor, we can add a PowerShell script. And that script downloads a version of Tabular Editor, installs it on our build agent, and in the next step, we've got the Tabular Editor and the deployment task. So that is a thing where we can build a pipeline, get the version, build and deploy it afterwards to the database, to the integration services environment, and the analysis services environment. Now let's start the pipeline, and the job is queued, and what we are using now is we are using our own Microsoft, not Microsoft hosted, we are using our own agent. And now we can see all those steps that were defined in the pipeline on the left side. On the right side, we've got the logging output, and database project is built, integration services project is built, and all those artifacts are deployed afterwards. And it takes 1 or 2 minutes before it is done. So I'm going to switch back to the slides to recap what we've seen. The automation, well, is done by using Azure DevOps pipelines. They are based on the YAML structure, yet another markup language, and we can use Microsoft hosted or self-hosted agents. And within those pipelines, we can start small, like just build the database project and see if there are any syntax errors. As a next step, we can deploy the database. We can deploy integration services. We can deploy analysis services. So start small and get bigger afterwards. For integration services, well, there are third-party tools like third-party build and pipeline tasks. For analysis services, we have Tabular Editor. We can use it, download it, and use the command line afterwards. For reporting services, there are PowerShell commandlets, and I've included the link on the slides over there. And for Power BI, there are also third-party tools or third-party pipeline tasks that you can use. And everything around Power BI automation is based on the Power BI REST API. So those are the methods that are provided within the Power BI service, and everything that comes afterwards over there uses the Power BI REST APIs. And there are, well, I named it BI DevOps in my list, Azure DevOps tasks. And I've built one of those pipelines to take, let's have a look at the repo over there. I've got Power BI reports in there, and I've built a pipeline that takes those Power BI reports and publish those reports to a workspace. In order to have a working workspace, we can use a Power BI task that is a third-party task too, to create a new workspace. And then we use the Power BI actions again to add users to that workspace. Specify the role, the permission level, publish the reports from our repository into the workspace. And last but not least, sometimes we need to change the database connection or the source connection. So we change it from one server name to another server name. So very, very easy to also use Power BI automation within Azure DevOps. Now back to our database environment. Well, it took 1 minute and 30 to publish the new version of our database. to our database environment or to our database, the production environment. But I also mentioned it would be nice to have a new development environment. So we've got a new database instance over there. No databases are there. And what you can do with your DevOps pipelines, when you go here, you can add some variables to the pipeline itself. And you can use that variables, and whenever you run that pipeline, you can override that information, like the SQL instance. And I would like to deploy it to the dev environment, and I would like to not call it wild word importers. I would like to call it Scottish importers. Hit the update, go back and start the pipeline. And we've got 1 or 2 minutes left. Let's run that job in the background and come back before the last slide. So Power BI automation using third-party tasks and getting smarter. The idea of variables. So it's a very, very good concept to start small, to start simple with your pipeline and get, well, more professional afterwards, because you can add variables and you can change those variables depending on the environment you would like to deploy to, depending on whatever. So it's very easy to build one pipeline that can be published to multiple environments. And as an outlook, as we only had that session time today, there are release pipelines that can be used to deploy to different environments, like the development, the user acceptance environment, the production environment. So it's a further step to get better and more reproducible release pipelines to publish to different environments. And to wrap it up, before we get to the overall, let's see, 1 minute and 10. We are currently in the process of deploying the databases. Let's wait if we get a green check mark over there. I'm gonna switch to my Management Studio, hit the refresh, and well, if it takes 2 minutes to create a new dev environment, well, those 2 minutes are well spent, because it was only 1 change or 2 changes of variable values, and our new environment is completely automated, created, because we've got new databases, we've got integration services packages deployed, we've got the version of the analysis services deployed, all in all 1 minute 47. So that's nice. And with that, well, we are at the end of our proof of concept week or proof of concept session. And to wrap it up, what were the goals of our week? We wanted to have a common development structure. We wanted to have one place to put the version or the source control, no more folder-based development. And we wanted to have a single version of the truth. So we needed version control. Database project was the kind of development approach that solved one of our problems. And with Azure DevOps, we got that kind of remote repository to store all our development artifacts. Automation, another thing, to build reproducible and repeatable processes, we used Azure DevOps pipelines. We used the concept of continuous integration and continuous development to fetch the current version, to build it, to validate it. You can even add unit testing in that process, and afterwards deploy it to the appropriate environment. We have an automated approach to create dev environments, and we've got traceability in there, and no more uncontrolled hotline duties. So a very, very good approach of getting into a very good way of adding new features to the project. So With that, I'm at the end of our short proof of concept week or session into the field of continuous integration for the business intelligence developer. I hope that there are or were some tips and tricks that you can use. I would recommend to have a look if you haven't done using database projects. Start with a small automation in Azure DevOps. And with that, thanks for your attention. Thanks for joining in and enjoy the rest of the conference.